Every family has a destiny, and for Ben Blackwood, it was written in the black ink of a billion-dollar legal firm. His world was polished marble, chilled steel, and the crushing weight of a prestigious legacy. By 30, he was supposed to run Boston. But what happens when destiny knocks you off course and smells like sourdough? When Ben was forced to liquidate an old property, he encountered Stephanie Moore, a fiery, no-nonsense baker whose small shop, The Daily Grind, became the secret sanctuary for his true dream. He was supposed to shut her down. Instead, he fell in love. This is the ultimate corporate escape. He risked his name, his inheritance, and his father's love for a chance at a real life. This is the story of the banker and the baker, and the powerful, defiant love that forced them to risk everything to build their own legacy, one perfect roast at a time.
The air in the offices of Blackwood and Finch was thick, not with dust or age, but with the quiet, expensive oppression of polished cherry wood and inherited expectation. Ben Blackwood, 28 and already a senior associate, sat at his mahogany desk, which had once belonged to his grandfather, feeling the weight of 4 generations of legal precedent pressing down on his shoulders. The view from his 34th floor corner office, a spectacular panorama of the Boston Common and the Gold Dome of the State House, was supposed to inspire ambition. Instead, it felt like the gilded bars of a very comfortable, very exclusive cage. Ben was the last of the Blackwood line, and every decision, from his choice of tie, conservative blue, never green, to his specialized focus on corporate liquidation, was an homage to the legacy he was expected to uphold. Partner by 30. That was the unwritten contract. That was the only acceptable future. He ran a hand over his meticulously organized desk, which was the only thing out of place being a worn copy of the World Atlas of Coffee, hidden deep in his bottom drawer. A silent, secret rebellion. He was supposed to be reviewing the acquisition documents for a major biotech firm, but his eyes kept returning to the memos slipped under his blotter. File BWF 305. Property liquidation, 147 Beacon Street. The property in question was an ancestral holding, a stately but long neglected 4-story brownstone in Beacon Hill, purchased by his great-great-grandfather, not as an investment, but as a placeholder for the family name. The family trust, now managed by his intimidating father, Arthur Blackwood, had finally decided it was a dead asset and needed to be converted into capital to shore up the family's investment portfolio. It was a simple, cut-and-dried task. Inventory the building, manage the existing tenants, and prepare it for a quick, profitable sale to a developer. A simple administrative exercise, Benjamin, his father had stated this morning, his voice a low, gravelly command that brooked no argument. Show me you can manage a transaction from start to finish without needing hand-holding. This is your test. Ben sighed, feeling the familiar, hollow churn of disappointment in his stomach. He wasn't testing his legal acumen. He was testing his obedience. The brownstone at 147 Beacon Street was everything the Blackwood and Finch offices were not. Warm, chaotic, and smelling intensely of something far better than leather and sterile paper. The top 3 floors were empty, echoing spaces, but the ground floor, which opened directly onto the street, was occupied by the Daily Grind. The moment he stepped inside, the chill, analytical demeanor he wore at the firm fractured. The shop was small, bustling, and vibrant, a riot of mismatched wooden tables, shelves overflowing with exotic coffee beans, and the kind of comforting clutter that spoke of real, lived-in joy. The dominant aroma was a potent, intoxicating mix of dark roast coffee and, surprisingly, the nutty, earthy tang of fermentation. Sourdough. Behind a high, distressed wood counter, amidst a flurry of steam and flour dust, stood Stephanie Moore. She was the antithesis of the severe, impeccably dressed women who populated his world. She wore a flour-dusted apron over comfortable jeans, her dark, practical hair tied up in a messy knot that allowed a few cheerful, rebellious curls to escape. Her movements were economical, yet graceful. Whether she was pulling a massive, golden-crusted loaf from the oven or deftly handling the commercial espresso machine, she had a scattering of freckles across the bridge of her nose that crinkled when she laughed, which Ben noticed immediately she did often and easily. She looked up as the bell above the door chimed, her eyes, a striking, intense hazel, meeting his. Ben, still in his tailored charcoal suit, felt absurdly overdressed, like a misplaced museum exhibit. "Welcome to the Daily Grind. Be with you in just a sec." She hung out, her voice a bright melodic counterpoint to the gentle hiss of the steamer. She finished pouring a perfect latte, handed it off with a genuine smile, and wiped her hands on her apron before turning to him fully. "What can I get for the man in the power suit? I'm guessing a double espresso, rushed to chase down a hostile takeover?" she asked, a playful challenge dancing in her eyes. Ben, who was prepared to deliver a cold, corporate spiel, found himself utterly disarmed. He had to clear his throat. "Actually," he managed, trying to sound professionally detached, "I'm Ben Blackwood. I'm here regarding the building. I'm drip coffee black and a plain croissant, please." Stephanie's smile didn't falter, but a keen, analytical edge entered her gaze. She was no pushover. "Ben Blackwood, Blackwood and Finch, the Blackwoods who own the building. I was wondering when you all would finally decide this place existed." She moved to the coffee urn, her back to him, and the shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The playful warmth was replaced by a quiet, fierce defensiveness. She placed the coffee and the perfectly laminated butter-scented croissant on the counter. "That'll be $5.75. And before you start your spiel, the lease is current and the health inspector loves us. We're not going anywhere." Ben produced a thick, embossed envelope containing the official notice of liquidation and a revised non-renewal lease notice effective in 90 days. The weight of the envelope felt like a betrayal in his own hand. "I appreciate your confidence, Ms. Moore, but the family has decided to liquidate the asset. The building is being prepared for sale," Ben stated, his voice now crisp and devoid of emotion, the Blackwood and Finch training kicking in like muscle memory. "The current tenancy agreement includes a standard 90-day relocation clause upon the announcement of sale, which I am hereby initiating." He pushed the envelope across the worn wood. Stephanie's cheerful demeanor finally broke. She didn't touch the envelope. Instead, she leaned her forearms on the counter, her hazel eyes narrowed into two determined slits. The aroma of yeast and beans seemed to thicken with tension. 90 days. That's enough time to ruin a business I poured every cent and every ounce of sweat into for the last 5 years. You walk in here in your $3,000 suit and you see an asset. I see my livelihood. I see the heart of this neighborhood. You're talking about tearing out something real for a number on a ledger. She picked up the envelope, but instead of opening it, she gripped it tightly between her thumb and forefinger, then placed it neatly next to the cash register. It was a gesture of respect for the law, but not submission. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice now steady, "I respect the law, but I don't respect the ruthlessness. You can have your coffee and your croissant. The payment is the $5.75, but you should know, I plan to fight you every step of the way." Then she delivered the kind of dazzling, authentic smile that made Ben's corporate facade feel flimsy and cheap. He walked out onto Beacon Street, the taste of expected corporate victory replaced by a sudden, profound, and unwelcome sense of loss. He had come to liquidate a building, and instead, he felt like he had just signed the eviction notice for his own secret dream. He drove back to the sterile heights of his office, the atlas of coffee calling to him from the bottom drawer, its silent promise of grinding beans and baking sourdough now inextricably linked to the determined, defiant gaze of Stephanie Moore. This wasn't just a simple administrative exercise anymore. It was a direct confrontation between the life he was born into and the life he was suddenly desperate to have. The countdown had begun.
Chapter 2. Back at Blackwood and Finch, the legal task had mutated from an administrative chore into a complex personal puzzle. Ben was supposed to be processing the next steps, ordering the property appraisal, drafting the sales prospectus, and scheduling the first walkthroughs for potential developers. Instead, he was buried deep in the labyrinthine archives of the Blackwood Family Trust, specifically the original, decades-old lease document for the ground floor commercial space. The eviction notice he had served was boilerplate, legally sound and entirely ruthless. But the longer he looked at the handwritten, faded addendums on the original 1960s lease, the more complicated the matter became. "There has to be something," he muttered to himself, tracing a finger over spidery script that spoke of a different era, a time when business was conducted more on a handshake and less on liability assessment. He found it late that evening, the blue glow of his desk lamp the only light in the cavernous office. It wasn't a flaw, it was a relic. Tucked into the termination and renewal clause was a bizarre provision, likely inserted by his eccentric great-uncle, requiring a formal, in-person assessment of the business's community value by a neutral third-party arbitrator prior to any forced tenancy termination. The provision had been overlooked in every subsequent digital scan and summary. It was arcane, practically unenforceable, and gloriously time-consuming. It was enough. It was a delay. It was a lifeline. He couldn't tell his father about the clause yet. That would invite scrutiny and immediate countermaneuvers. But he could use it as a silent, internal justification for his next move, maintaining an intense, ongoing presence at the daily grind. The next morning, Ben returned to 147 Beacon Street. He wasn't wearing the charcoal suit. He opted for tailored gray trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a sport coat. Still corporate, but less like a judge and more like a very high-paid consultant. He walked in to find Stephanie wrestling with a delivery of 50-pound bags of artisanal flour. She was flushed, sweaty, and cursing softly under her breath. "Need a hand, Miss Moore?" Ben asked, stepping immediately out of character. He didn't wait for an answer, simply shedding his coat and rolling up his sleeves, revealing forearms that, while pale from desk work, were nonetheless capable. Stephanie paused, one bag half lifted. She stared at him, bewildered. "Blackwood? What are you doing? Shouldn't you be foreclosing on a small nation somewhere?" "Due diligence," Ben replied, smoothly adopting his cover story. "Since the liquidation process requires a complete inventory and analysis of all existing operations, including tenant challenges, I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with. And right now, I'm dealing with 50 pounds of heritage grain blocking the fire exit." He swung the bag onto his shoulder. The unexpected, satisfying weight felt good, grounding. He followed her into the small, hot back kitchen where the heavy, comforting steam of a professional proofing oven hung in the air. "This is not due diligence, Mr. Blackwood. This is manual labor. Your firm charges $500 an hour for due diligence. Consider it a flat-rate consultation. I need to get started on the real due diligence, which in a food service environment requires observation. Extensive, repetitive observation. Stephanie raised a skeptical eyebrow, the hazel eyes twinkling. Meaning, you're going to use my shop as a remote office and drink my coffee until you find a way to tear it down? Meaning, I need to fully document the customer flow, product quality, and community engagement. I need data on the value of this establishment, and that requires me to be here a lot. He settled into a corner booth, the darkest spot in the shop. He opened his laptop, but instead of the biotech merger, he pulled up a blank spreadsheet titled 147 Beacon Street, Commercial Tenant Viability and Legal Defense Strategy. Over the next few days, Ben became a fixture. He would arrive early, stay late, and always order the same thing: black coffee and a plain croissant. He found that the croissant at the Daily Grind was not just a pastry. It was a multi-layered masterpiece, crispy exterior giving way to a pillow-soft interior. He watched Stephanie work, her patience with the sourdough starter, which she treated like a temperamental pet, the way she remembered every customer's name and usual order, and the genuine concern she showed when a local artist complained about their rent. One afternoon, a frantic customer complained that their coffee was burnt. Stephanie, without argument, immediately made a new batch for the entire urn. "It's the small things, Ben," she explained later as she wiped down the counter. "I don't just sell coffee. I sell a moment of peace and a promise of quality. That's my real product." That night, Ben went back to his empty, polished apartment. He looked at the stark white walls and the perfectly arranged books he hadn't read, and the hollowness of his own product, the cold, efficient dismantling of other people's dreams, ached in his chest. He realized he wasn't just delaying the eviction for Stephanie, he was delaying it for himself. He was using his high-powered legal skill set to create a secret sanctuary, a temporary truce in the war he didn't know he was fighting against his own life. The irony was suffocating. He was supposed to represent the Blackwood legacy, but all he wanted was to trade his briefcase for a flour-dusted apron, the smell of expensive cologne for the heady, comforting aroma of a fresh-baked croissant. He emailed his father, reporting a slight delay due to unforeseen complexity in the commercial lease agreement and the need for additional on-site assessment. He kept his tone professional, crisp, and slightly annoyed by the inconvenience. Arthur Blackwood's reply was instantaneous and clipped. "Resolve it swiftly, Benjamin. I expect this building to be on the market by the end of the month. Your commitment to efficiency is noted and currently wanting." The pressure was mounting. The delay he had created was temporary, but every black coffee he drank, every perfect croissant he ate, and every moment he spent watching Stephanie Moore live a life of passionate authenticity was slowly eroding the foundation of Ben Blackwood, corporate heir. He knew that soon he would have to make his move, but for now, he would hide in plain sight, an undercover agent of defiance right in the heart of the enemy territory, the Daily Grind. The corner booth at the Daily Grind had become Ben's second office, though it bore no resemblance to the clinical severity of Blackwood and Finch. Here, his corporate laptop was softened by the background chatter, the rhythmic thud of the tamper, and the constant comforting heat of the ovens. His official due diligence reports consisted of meticulous, detailed accounts of inventory and foot traffic, data that could easily be construed as preparation for a hostile takeover, but which Ben was secretly using to map out Stephanie's operational strengths and weaknesses, forming the backbone of her eventual defense. He found himself staying later and later. The afternoon rush would dissipate, the local students and remote workers would pack up, and Stephanie would begin the Herculean task of cleaning and prep for the next day. It was during these quiet, transitional hours that Ben saw the true labor involved, and where the most glaring vulnerability of the daily grind became apparent: the paperwork. Stephanie was an artist with yeast and heat, a brilliant entrepreneur driven by passion, but she was utterly, hopelessly disorganized when it came to ledgers, invoices, and quarterly tax filings. Her system was a series of overflowing cardboard boxes labeled with names like maybe taxes, definitely receipts, and things to deal with when I have time. One evening, after she had accidentally overpaid a supplier by a substantial margin, Ben finally intervened. She was slumped over a greasy, coffee-stained workbook, her forehead creased with frustration. "You're going to lose the place to the IRS before my father even gets a chance," Ben murmured, setting down his empty mug. Stephanie looked up, her usually vibrant eyes dull with exhaustion. "It's all the joy of baking and none of the satisfaction. I just want to make bread that makes people happy. Why does there have to be so much paper?" "Because the law requires it," Ben replied with a small, genuine smile, the kind of smile he never allowed in the office. He pulled his laptop closer. "Let me help. Seriously, I specialize in corporate structure. Finding patterns in financial chaos is literally my job description." Stephanie hesitated, wary. "What's the catch, Blackwood? Are you going to find some forgotten tax lien and use it to execute a quick eviction? If I were, I wouldn't waste my time helping you fix it." Ben countered, meeting her skeptical gaze with earnestness. "Call it a professional challenge. Call it hedging my bets on the community value assessment. A financially sound business is a better fight than a chaotic one." She finally relented, pushing the boxes towards him with a sigh of defeat. "Fine, but if you try to charge me your hourly rate, I'll pay you in day-old rye and scorn." And so began their nightly ritual, the late-night ledger. As the Boston evenings settled in and the last of the city's sounds became muffled, Ben Blackwood, the heir to a legal empire, would sit in a humble coffee shop, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled past his elbows, meticulously sorting, documenting, and digitizing the tangled finances of the daily grind. He created a cloud-based accounting system, reconciled months of mismatched invoices, and most satisfyingly, designed a system that would allow Stephanie to track her best-selling items and inventory in real time. For the first time in his career, he felt like his skills were being used to build something, not dismantle it. One night, around 11 p.m., after successfully locating an entire quarter's worth of missing payroll records, Stephanie brought him a slice of freshly baked chocolate babka, a dense, swirling masterpiece, and a mug of hot, milky chai. "You're amazing, you know," she said, sitting opposite him, her voice quiet in the vast empty space. "This is weeks of misery fixed in 4 hours. You could be running the world and you're organizing my receipts." Ben took a bite of the babka. It was rich, decadent, and tasted like true comfort, a far cry from the bland catered canopies of his usual late-night office work. "I am running my world," he corrected softly. "This shop, this building, it's the only real thing I've touched in years." He risked a vulnerability he never allowed himself at Blackwood and Finch. Do you ever feel like you're playing a role that was written for someone else? Like the costume fits perfectly, but you're suffocating inside it? Stephanie's cheerful energy softened into deep empathy. She didn't offer a corporate platitude, she offered a story. "My parents wanted me to be a teacher, safe, pensionable, respectable. I tried for a year. I hated it. I was miserable. I kept staring out the window, watching the steam rise from the bakery across the street. I was terrified to disappoint them, but I was more terrified to wake up at 50 and realize I never tried to make my life." She gestured around the dimly lit shop, her eyes shining with fierce pride. The day I signed the lease here, they didn't speak to me for 6 months. They called it a phase. They said I was throwing away my education. But look, this is mine. The mistakes are mine, the victories are mine, and the flour dust on the floor is mine. It's the opposite of suffocating. Ben looked at her, truly seeing the courage it took to stand here, alone and defiance of expectation. He realized his own secret dream, the coffee shop, was not a trivial hobby. It was a desperate plea for the same kind of authentic, messy ownership. My dream, Ben confessed, keeping his voice low, is not to make partner. It's to roast beans. I want to understand the alchemy of the perfect shot, the acidity, the body, the mouthfeel. I want to build a menu around single origin beans, not just sell a commodity. He paused, then confessed the biggest part of the secret. I've been collecting equipment and researching profiles for 3 years. It's my escape. It's the complete opposite of liquidation. Stephanie studied him for a long moment, a genuine warmth replacing her initial skepticism. A secret coffee nerd hiding in a $5,000 suit? That's a good plot twist, Blackwood. She tapped her fingers on the organized pile of newly printed receipts. So you know how to build a corporate defense, and you know how to talk about the mouthfeel of a geisha varietal. Interesting combination. Is that a positive assessment? Ben asked, a sudden anxiety gripping him. He had exposed a part of himself that only his hidden book knew. Stephanie smiled, a tired but genuine curve of her lips. It means you have a secret worth fighting for, and I appreciate that. Now, put that legal brain of yours to work on the utility bill from last February. I think the meter reader had a holiday and charged me for 3 months at once. Then pulled the bill, his heart a little lighter, his sense of purpose sharper. He was still the corporate lawyer, but now he was moonlighting as a dream defender. Every hour he spent in the warm, yeasty air of the daily grind was an hour stolen from the cold, sterile future his family had planned. He was preparing the ground for the sale, yes, but he was also secretly preparing the case for a life he truly wanted. The late-night ledger wasn't just about receipts, it was about balancing 2 very different lives, a balancing act he knew couldn't last forever. The 2 worlds Ben Blackwood inhabited were tearing him in half. By day, he wore the corporate armor, crisp shirts, measured responses, and the cool detachment required to handle 9-figure mergers. He was preparing for the final presentation on the massive biotech acquisition, a deal that, if closed successfully, would all but guarantee his partnership track. He practiced his pitch in the echoing silence of his apartment, the words smooth, persuasive, and completely devoid of soul. By night, he was the secret apprentice, the flour-dusted shadow who stayed late at the daily grind, his hands stained with coffee oils and his mind buzzing with ideas that had nothing to do with corporate law. The stress was manifesting physically. He was running on black coffee, Stephanie's black coffee, and adrenaline. He'd catch himself in the reflection of the espresso machine, looking tired, but undeniably, dangerously alive. The only thing that felt real was the heat from the oven, and the sharp, bright challenge in Stephanie's hazel eyes. Stephanie, sensing the suffocating pressure of his professional life, didn't let him retreat into the ledger work. She knew his secret dream wasn't just about filing away the perfect business plan. It was about the tangible, physical reality of creation. She pulled him into the tiny, low-ceilinged back room, which housed a relic of the building's past, a small, cast-iron roaster nicknamed the Dragon, which the previous owner had left behind. You'd talk a good game about acidity and body, but you can't truly understand coffee until you roast it. It's chemistry, Ben. It's the moment the green bean dies and is reborn as flavor. It's terrifying and beautiful. Ben felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated excitement. a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a boy, building elaborate structures out of salvaged wood. He'd studied the process for years, but here, now, in the presence of the warm metallic machine, it was real. She instructed him on the fundamentals, the charge temperature, the drying phase where the bean loses moisture, the delicate Maillard reaction that develops sweetness, and finally, the terrifying sound of thirst crack. The moment the bean expands and the process accelerates toward the finish line. The sound of the roaster, a rhythmic, industrial churn, was mesmerizing. Ben watched the beans tumble inside the rotating drum, tracking the temperature curve on the digital readout he'd installed last week. His focus was absolute. He wasn't thinking about Arthur Blackwood or Richard Sterling. He was thinking about heat transfer and chemical structure. When the beans hit the perfect golden brown color and the rapid popping of first crack began, Stephanie's hand shot out, not to stop him, but to steady his arm. Okay, listen to it. Don't look at the numbers. Listen. That's the soul of the coffee breaking open. Now watch for the color change. The cinnamon stage is just before it goes too far. Their hands were almost touching, his knuckles brushing the soft, flour-dusted skin of her wrist. The air in the tiny room was thick with the rich, intoxicating scent of roasting coffee, and beneath that, a new, volatile tension. He was so focused on the sound of the cracking beans and the terrifying responsibility of not burning the batch that he nearly missed the feeling, a powerful, almost magnetic pull toward the woman standing beside him, sharing the secret, passionate act of creation. He managed to keep his composure, expertly releasing the beans into the cooling tray. The aroma of the freshly roasted batch, still smoking slightly, was phenomenal, a potent blend of toasted nuts and dark caramel. "It's perfect," Ben breathed, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. "No," she corrected, her voice soft but intense. "That's yours. That's the first roast of Ben Blackwood, coffee master." The compliment, delivered with such sincerity, felt like a medal of honor. He had finally created something real, something outside the legal brief. The shared passion, however, was immediately tested by the mundane realities of an old Boston brownstone. The following evening, as Ben was comparing Stephanie's local supplier prices, a distinct, sickly smell of damp earth and rust began to permeate the air, followed by a low, persistent drip, drip, drip from the ceiling near the back pantry. Stephanie cursed, a quick, colorful French phrase she hadn't taught him yet. "Oh, not tonight." "That's the drain pipe from the second floor. It's been clogging for months. I can't afford a commercial plumber on short notice, especially not one that specializes in a 100-year-old pipe system." Panic started to color her expression. If the leak became a flood, it would ruin her expensive, moisture-sensitive flour and possibly trigger a new immediate termination clause in the lease Ben hadn't even realized existed, damage due to tenant negligence. "Relax," Ben said, the legal panic momentarily overriding the romantic tension. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was also the son of a family that had owned and renovated properties for generations. He knew old houses. "It's a clog, not a break. I've dealt with this in my family's summer house. It needs a snake and a high-grade enzyme, not a $5,000 emergency call." He located the access panel in the back wall. Stephanie watched astonished as Ben Blackwood, the man who argued Supreme Court precedent, expertly pulled on a pair of greasy work gloves he'd stashed under the sink. "I may be an heir to a legal dynasty, Stephanie, but my father is a relentless micromanager. I've spent more time fixing things in his various properties than I ever have arguing a motion." Ben explained, pushing his suit jacket aside. He retrieved a heavy-duty manual drain snake that Stephanie had forgotten she owned. For the next hour, Ben was a man completely transformed. He was sprawled on the grimy floor, working the snake deep into the old narrow pipe, his face set in concentration. He was sweaty, covered in the unglamorous residue of a plumbing backup, but he was solving a real, immediate, and tangible problem. The sight of him, The expensive watch, the impeccably tailored clothes now ruined, the intense focus was a jarring yet thrilling spectacle. Stephanie knelt beside him, holding the flashlight steady. Her initial panic was replaced by a deep, appreciative awe. "You really are full of surprises, aren't you, Ben? I learned a long time ago that knowing how to build and fix things is the only way to retain control. In law, you just manage existing messes. Here, you get to prevent them." With a final sickening lurch, the snake struck and cleared the blockage. The sound of water rushing freely through the drainpipe was a symphony of success. Ben slowly extracted the snake, which was covered in the kind of ancient, terrifying sludge only 100-year-old plumbing can produce. He stood up, looking like he'd been dragged backward through a swamp, but radiating a triumphant energy. Stephanie, without thinking, reached out and brushed a piece of grime from his cheek, her touch immediate and tender. "You saved the flower," she whispered, her eyes wide with gratitude. "And the shop. Thank you, Ben." It was the most genuine moment of connection they'd ever shared. Ben's triumph was forgotten. His mind registered only her proximity, the soft touch of her hand on his cheek, and the sudden, overwhelming realization that he had never felt more seen or more useful in his entire life. The corporate veneer, the suit, the Blackwood name, it all fell away, leaving just Ben, the man who fixed pipes and dreamed of coffee. He leaned in. The raw, unfiltered desire to bridge the final narrow gap between them was a palpable force. Their gazes locked, the heat from the recently active roaster and the physical exertion combining to create a dizzying, intoxicating atmosphere. It was the moment of inevitable combination, the perfect cinematic moment for a first kiss. But the moment was shattered by the harsh, insistent ring of Ben's phone. It was Arthur. He jerked back, his professional conditioning an unwelcome shock of cold water. He looked down at the ruined, filthy clothes, then at the time. It was past midnight. "I have to take this," he said, his voice husky with sudden tension. He pulled out the phone, seeing his father's name flashing ominously on the screen. He answered, slipping immediately back into the gilded lie. "Father? Yes, I'm just leaving the site now. Significant structural issues with the plumbing, delaying the final valuation report. Yes, purely administrative, but it requires delicate handling. I'll have the summary on your desk by 8 a.m. He hung up, the lie tasting like ash after the sweet authenticity of the plumbing job. He looked at Stephanie, who was watching him with a mixture of sympathy and sorrow. "The gilded cage always calls," she said, picking up the dirty tools. "It's a prison with excellent cell service," he countered, forcing a small smile. "I'll clean up this mess. I'll send you the plumber's enzyme I use. I'll see you tomorrow." He knew the truth. He wasn't just fixing a pipe. He was fixing a life. And the closer he got to Stephanie, the more desperately he needed to find a way to make his permanent residence here, in the messy, real world of the daily grind, even if it meant sacrificing everything the Blackwood name stood for. The successful corporate presentation he'd scheduled for next week felt less like a triumph and more like a final farewell to his true self.
Chapter 5. The reprieve Ben had engineered with the community value clause had run its course. The family trust, under Arthur Blackwood's stern direction, had been forced to engage a third-party arbitrator. The appointment was set. Eleanor Vance, a meticulous, elderly former judge known for her rigorous adherence to protocol and her surprising soft spot for historical preservation. She was due to assess the property and its tenant in 10 days. The pressure was enormous. Ben had already submitted a preliminary legal brief arguing for the shop's unique historical contribution to Beacon Hill, but he knew that paperwork alone wouldn't sway Judge Vance. They needed emotional weight, community testimonials, and, most importantly, photographic evidence of Stephanie's integration into the local fabric. We can't just talk about community value stuff. We have to show it. This is a visual argument. We need to document every local school order, every farmers market collaboration, every little library group that meets here.
Stephanie gestured at the mountain of preparation, the newly organized financial statements, the list of loyal customers, the testimonials Ben had helped her draft. "I'm a baker, not a documentary filmmaker, Ben. I can barely take a decent selfie, let alone capture the essence of community. I'm here from 4 a.m. until closing. I have no time to go chasing down sentimental photo ops." "Then we make the time," Ben decided. He closed his laptop with a decisive snap. "We'll start tonight. Think of it as a reconnaissance mission. The arbitrator's assessment is high stakes. This is the last legal barrier I can buy you before my father moves to a full-scale eviction." And so their professional partnership quietly, accidentally, morphed into their first unofficial date. That evening, Ben was waiting for Stephanie when she finally locked up, wearing clothes that were neither corporate armor nor plumbing gear. Dark jeans, a lightweight premium sweater, and a casual demeanor that suited the charming old-world streets of Beacon Hill far better than his suits ever did. "Ready to document the socio-economic impact of a perfect bagel?" he asked, offering her a thermos of sparkling cider he'd brought along. Stephanie laughed, the tension of the long workday melting away. "Only if you can frame the shot to make my exhausted, flour-streaked face look like a hard-working hero." Their first stop was a small, independent art gallery 3 blocks away. Stephanie supplied their weekly gallery opening refreshments: miniature sourdough loaves and specialized coffee flights. The gallery owner, a cheerful bohemian woman named Maya, greeted them with a hug and immediately launched into a passionate defense of the daily grind. "Stephanie is the oxygen of this block," Judge Vance's assessment notwithstanding. "She hosts our poetry night. She uses her waste coffee grounds for my outdoor sculpture garden compost. And she literally brought life back to this end of Beacon Street. If she goes, we all suffer." Ben, standing back and using his professional camera, a high-end model he'd originally bought for architectural photography, captured the exchange: Maya's fierce protection, Stephanie's humble embarrassment, and the beautiful, honest connection between them. He realized he wasn't just taking pictures. He was documenting a love affair between a woman and her neighborhood. Their journey continued through the quiet, cobblestone streets. They walked to the small community garden where Stephanie donated compost and ran a tiny weekly baking class for local kids. They photographed the old-fashioned hardware store where she bought her specialized flowers in bulk, and the elderly couple's antique shop where she held her impromptu coffee cupping events. As the sun set, casting a golden, romantic light over the historic brownstones, they settled on a bench overlooking the common. They shared a loaf of Stephanie's signature olive bread and the sparkling cider. "This is better than any boardroom dinner," Ben admitted, tearing off a piece of the savory bread. He felt completely relaxed, the constant knot of anxiety in his chest loosening for the first time in months. "Of course it is," Stephanie countered, sipping her cider. "You're eating something that took time and love, not something corporate caterers put together under fluorescent lighting. You're living in the present moment, Ben. That's what you give up when you chase the partnership." Ben looked out at the twinkling lights of the city skyline, the same skyline that held his father's tower. "I'm scared, Steph. Truly terrified. The closer I get to this life, to this shop, to you, the more I realize I can't go back. But when I leave B&F, I lose everything. My name, my access, my capital. I lose the security that my family spent a century building." Stephanie reached across the gap between them, placing a comforting hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, grounding, and absolutely non-judgmental. "And you gain the opportunity to build your own legacy, Ben Blackwood. Maybe the Blackwood name isn't meant to stand for legal acquisition and liquidation anymore. Maybe it's meant to stand for the best single-origin espresso in Boston. You have the skill, the palate, and the business mind to make that happen. All you have to do is choose freedom over comfort." He looked into her eyes, seeing a future reflected there, a future that smelled like roasted coffee and yeast, and felt like home.
I'm doing this because I believe in you, Steph. I believe in what you built here, and I believe in the life you lead. I want to fight for that, even if it means fighting my own blood." Stephanie squeezed his arm gently. "Good, because with the arbitrator coming, we're going to need to be ready to fight. And thank you, Mr. Blackwood, for the accidental date, and for making me look like a hard-working hero." As they walked back through the quiet streets, Ben realized he had successfully gathered the legal evidence he needed. But more importantly, he had gathered the emotional evidence. He was falling in love with Stephanie Moore and the life she represented. He had found his purpose in her presence, and that feeling, that sense of belonging, was more powerful than any Blackwood legacy. The stakes were no longer just about a lease. It was about his heart. He knew that the arbitration meeting was not just a legal battle, it was his last chance to buy time, and he had to win. He spent the rest of the night reviewing the photographs, not as a lawyer preparing a case, but as a man cherishing the visual proof of the world he wanted to belong to.
Chapter 6. The biotech merger presentation at Blackwood and Finch was a staggering success. Ben, fueled by a caffeine blend of his own perfect roast and the adrenaline of his double life, was razor sharp, presenting the complex acquisition strategy with a confidence and clarity that impressed even the senior partners. He argued every clause, anticipated every objection, and closed the deal in record time. The next morning, Arthur Blackwood called him into his office. The meeting wasn't a reprimand, it was an anointment. "Brilliant work, Benjamin," Arthur said, his voice unusually warm, though still retaining its characteristic resonance of authority. "Sterling himself admitted you've outpaced him. The firm is deeply satisfied. We are moving up the timeline. We will announce your partnership next quarter." He leaned back in his leather chair, a portrait of patriarchal pride. "This is the reward for discipline, for dedication to the legacy. Now, as a final administrative act before we finalize your new role, deal with that Beacon Street property, close the lease termination, sell it to the highest bidder, and wipe it off the ledger. I want no loose ends tied to your name as a partner." The partnership, the life he was trained for, the prize he was supposed to crave, was now within reach. But as Arthur spoke the words, Ben felt only a crushing wave of claustrophobia. The partnership felt like a sentence, a golden shackle that would bind him forever to a life of perpetual liquidation. He nodded, maintaining his impassive professional demeanor. "Understood, Father. I will finalize the lease termination after the arbitrator's assessment next week. Then the sale process begins." He left the office, the whispers of partner, 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 echoing in the halls, but all he could hear was the hiss of the espresso machine and Stephanie's earnest voice talking about first crack. That evening at the Daily Grind, the euphoria of the corporate victory evaporated completely. He told Stephanie about the accelerated timeline, the partnership, and the finality of the arbitrator's impending visit. "Next week, Steph, this is it. If we lose the assessment, the family moves immediately to termination. The 90 days starts then, and I'm legally bound to execute the sale. I can't stop it from the inside anymore. I have to choose now." Stephanie looked at him, her expression a mix of concern and a strange, determined hope. "Then let's plan for what comes after. Win or lose the lease, you and I need to stop talking about a hypothetical shop and start building a real one. Let's design our legacy, Ben." It was a reckless, beautiful, and utterly compelling idea. They decided to use the few days they had before the assessment to build a formal business plan for a new specialty coffee house, a plan that Ben could execute once he walked away from Blackwood and Finch. They were building their future, a blueprint for defiance, right there on the counter of the shop they might soon lose. They brainstormed names, the common grounds, Blackwood and Moore Roasters, before Ben vetoed the latter with a laugh.
mocked up layouts, and meticulously charted the startup capital Ben possessed from his carefully managed trust fund, money his father thought was reserved for future corporate investments. The market needs a specialty roaster that also bakes in-house, Stephanie explained, sketching a layout that prioritized a small, open roasting area. The aroma is half the experience, Ben. We sell the journey, not just the cup. Ben, using his financial modeling skills, was in his element. He calculated profitability margins, created cost of goods sold spreadsheets that included the rising price of artisanal flour, and drafted an investor prospectus. For the first time, their conversations were purely about a shared future, not a shared defense. The air between them was electric with creative possibility and burgeoning, undeniable affection. The deeper they plunged into their shared vision, the harder it was to maintain the facade. The lines of professional conduct had been obliterated by pipe grease, late-night babka, and the scent of freshly roasted beans. One night, Stephanie was leaning over Ben's shoulder, pointing to a detail on the projected P&L statement, her hair slightly damp from the evening shower she'd taken in her tiny upstairs apartment. Wait, the projected revenue growth on the retail beans is too conservative. We can undercut the bigger players by 5% because we eliminate the middleman. We need to leverage that advantage. Ben turned his head to speak, and their faces were separated by an inch of charged, impossible air. His heart hammered a violent rhythm against his ribs. He could feel her breath, warm and soft, and the shared intensity of the moment, the thrill of the business plan, the danger of their secret, and the intimacy of the late hour made his head swim. "Stephanie," he started, his voice a low, strangled whisper. He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, the softness of her skin a startling contrast to the cold glass of his laptop screen. The moment was perfect, inevitable, and right then, a flash of light cut through the front window of the shop. Ben pulled back instantly, his legal paranoia kicking in like a survival instinct. "Did you see that? A camera flash?" Stephanie, startled, looked out onto the street. The area was quiet, the gas lamps casting their soft, deceptive glow. "Probably just a tourist, Ben. This is Beacon Hill. People take pictures all the time." But Ben's gut, honed by years of sniffing out corporate fraud and hostile surveillance, screamed danger. It was too low stuff, too quick. Not a tourist shot. It felt like a telephone lens from a car. He rushed to the front door, peering out the window and scanning the street. The only car parked nearby was a dark, nondescript sedan about 50 feet down the street. It was too dark to see the driver, but the car was running. A cold, certain dread settled over him. Richard Sterling, the junior partner, obsessed with Ben's quick rise and desperate to prove his own worth, had been unearily quiet since the successful merger. Sterling had always been suspicious of Ben's prolonged, inexplicable absence from the office. He must have followed Ben tonight. "We have to assume we were seen," Ben said, his voice clipped and professional, the lawyer back in control, but with an edge of fierce protection. "Not kissing, thank God, but definitely together, late at night, with me handling sensitive documents in your possession." He could spin this as an inappropriate relationship, a violation of fiduciary duty, or worse, collusion to delay a legal asset liquidation. Stephanie was immediately galvanized, her fear turning to action. "Okay, what's the protocol? We're officially still locked up. We can't just walk out together." "We can't be seen together for the next 24 hours. I need to slip out the back, circle the block, and verify that car is gone before I go home. You need to stay put. If he tries to talk to you, say nothing. Refer him to the family trust's legal counsel. Me, always me." They executed the plan with the precision of two co-conspirators. Ben grabbed his jacket, a sense of high-stakes espionage electrifying the air. Before he left, he paused at the back door. He didn't lean in for a kiss, though the desire was a burning ache in his chest. Instead, he gripped her shoulders, his gaze intensely focused. "I will not let my family hurt you, Steph. Whatever happens with the arbitrator, I have your back. You and this dream." "Go, Blackwood," she said, her voice firm. "I'll hold down the fort, and I'll be here when you're ready to trade that briefcase for an apron." Ben slipped out the back, his heart pounding. The danger was palpable. He knew that Richard Sterling was not interested in saving the Blackwood legacy. He was interested in destroying Ben. The gilded lie had been photographed, and the consequences were about to be catastrophic. The final confrontation was only days away.
Chapter 7. The day of the arbitrator's assessment dawned cold and clear, the winter light casting long, sharp shadows across Beacon Hill. The daily grind, usually a haven of comforting chaos, was transformed into a place of tense, unnatural order. Stephanie had baked her best bread and pastries, laid out her finest single-origin pour-overs, and meticulously arranged the community testimonials. Ben arrived early, wearing his most sober corporate suit, which suddenly felt less like armor and more like a costume. The surveillance threat from Richard Sterling had forced them to maintain a rigid distance, communicating only through encrypted messages and carefully worded innocuous phone calls. Their shared vulnerability had intensified their bond, making this final confrontation all the more fraught. At precisely 10 a.m., Eleanor Vance arrived. The elderly former judge was as formidable as her reputation suggested. Sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed in a vintage suit, and possessing an aura of absolute, unyielding protocol. She was accompanied by a neutral clerk carrying a heavy notebook. "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Moore." Judge Vance greeted them with a cool, formal nod. "This assessment is strictly governed by the archaic language of the 1968 lease addendum, to determine the demonstrable community value of the daily grind, above and beyond mere market profitability. Please be concise and stick to the facts." Ben began the presentation, slipping into the familiar, confident rhythm of a senior associate arguing a complex case. He didn't speak of the law, he spoke of the life around the law. He introduced the photographic essay they had captured, projecting images onto a temporary screen he'd set up. Pictures of Stephanie helping children with their tiny garden plots, the vibrant scene of the community poetry night, and the genuine, unscripted moments of human connection. "The financial reports, Judge," Ben stated, switching slides to show the clean, organized spreadsheets he and Stephanie had labored over, "show a healthy, solvent, and tax-compliant business. But the photographs demonstrate a non-monetary asset, social capital. Miss Moore doesn't just pay rent, she invests her time, goods, and energy into the very fabric of this block. The loss of this tenant is not just a commercial transaction for the Blackwood Family Trust. It is a direct depreciation of the quality of life for 34 local families." Stephanie then stepped forward to address the culinary and craft aspects. She presented a tiered tasting of her breads and coffees, a masterpiece of fermentation and flavor profiling. She spoke not of price points, but of process. The 3-day journey of her sourdough starter, the meticulous chemical precision of the cast iron roaster, the local sourcing of her milk and grains. She directed the clerk to a small, laminated binder Ben had insisted she create. "This binder, Judge Vance, contains the signed testimonials from the community, not just customers, but other business owners who rely on the daily grind's foot traffic. My presence here generates business and preserves the non-corporate identity of this historical district." Judge Vance listened in silence, occasionally making sharp, precise notes. She tasted the coffee, a high-acidity, beautifully roasted Ethiopian yirgacheffe, and sampled a small, tart piece of apple cake. Then she turned her attention to Ben. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice dry, "you have made a compelling, if sentimental, argument. I note the extraordinary detail and passion in this defense, which seems rather unusual for an associate tasked with executing a liquidation. Have you at any point disclosed your clear conflict of interest in this matter to the Blackwood Family Trust?" The air in the room froze. Ben felt the blood drain from his face. It was the question he had dreaded, the legal consequence of the gilded lie. Before he could answer,
the door chimed, and Arthur Blackwood walked in, flanked by Richard Sterling, the picture of predatory professional power. Arthur's face was a mask of cold fury. Sterling wore a smug, venomous smile. "No, Judge Vance, he has not," Arthur Blackwood thundered, stepping directly into the tense scene. "Ben Blackwood is in deep violation of his fiduciary duty to the family trust. He has wasted firm resources, deliberately delayed this liquidation, and, most damningly, entered into a secret, non-professional relationship with the tenant." He gestured sharply to Richard Sterling, who smoothly presented Judge Vance and the clerk with the printed packet. It was the surveillance evidence from the night before. Clear, grainy photos of Ben and Stephanie leaning over the laptop, their heads close, Ben's hand touching her cheek, followed by photos of Ben slipping out the back door moments before Sterling's car drove away. "He is not defending the trust's asset, Judge Vance," he spat, leveling a finger at Ben. "He is protecting his mistress and her failing bakery. He is actively colluding to sabotage the sale. This is not a conflict of interest. This is gross professional misconduct." The world dissolved around Ben. He looked at Stephanie, whose face had gone pale, but whose chin remained stubbornly lifted. He looked at Arthur, realizing the depth of his father's betrayal was not just professional, but personal. Judge Vance, completely unfazed by the dramatic intrusion, held up a hand for silence. She reviewed the photos, then calmly placed them on the table. Then she looked at Arthur Blackwood, her eyes steel blue and unforgiving. "Mr. Blackwood, whether your son is involved with the tenant is a matter for your firm's ethics committee, not this arbitration. I am here only to assess the community value based on the lease language, and I have made my decision." She turned to Ben and Stephanie, a slight, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. "Mr. Blackwood and Miss Moore have presented an undeniable case. This business, through its specialized products and unique engagement with the non-commercial sector, fulfills the obscure legal requirement of demonstrable community value. The daily grind is protected by this clause. The family trust is legally barred from executing a forced termination based on liquidation grounds." She closed her notebook with a decisive snap. "Miss Moore retains the tenancy on a protected lease for an additional 1 year." Ben felt a dizzying surge of euphoria. They had won. They had bought a year, an entire year. But the victory was immediately overshadowed by the chilling silence of his father's rage. Arthur Blackwood didn't look at Judge Vance. He only looked at Ben, his face promising annihilation. "You have chosen your side, Benjamin. Enjoy your victory. You will be hearing from Human Resources tomorrow morning. Effective immediately, you are relieved of all duties and access to Blackwood and Finch. You are no longer an associate. You are no longer my heir. You are nothing."
Chapter 8. The confrontation earlier had ended in a clean break. Ben was disinherited and fired, but Stephanie had won her year of tenancy. Now, the euphoria of victory gave way to the harsh, bright reality of Ben's new life. He spent the first night of his freedom at the daily grind, watching Stephanie work. The next morning, he had nothing but the clothes on his back, a single suitcase he'd managed to pack before being escorted from Blackwood and Finch, and his personal capital, the trust fund money he had meticulously saved for his coffee venture. Arthur Blackwood was surgically precise in his retaliation. Ben's corporate access was revoked, his apartment lease, owned by the trust, was terminated with 30 days' notice, and his name was publicly scrubbed from the firm's website. The official story, leaked by Richard Sterling, was a brief, brutal paragraph citing gross breach of ethics and fiduciary duty. The media attention was intense. The Boston Globe ran a piece under the headline, "Corporate Heir Abandons Legacy for Beacon Hill Baker."
The tone was sneering and dismissive, framing Ben as a soft-headed romantic throwing away $100 million future for a fleeting affair. Back at the shop, Stephanie watched the transformation with a quiet intensity. The Ben Blackwood who showed up the day after his firing was not the stressed, guarded corporate lawyer. He was a man stripped down to his core. He wore jeans, a plain shirt, and most tellingly, he had abandoned his expensive engraved watch. He looked lost, but fundamentally lighter. "So, partner," Stephanie said one afternoon, finding Ben staring blankly at the espresso machine. He flinched at the word partner. It now carried a weight completely different from his father's usage. "You won my war, but you lost your oars. How does it feel to be officially unemployable?" He managed a genuine, if weary, smile. "It feels like a massive, terrifying relief. I've never slept better. But I also feel like a newborn giraffe. I know I'm supposed to stand up and run, but all my legs are wobbly." He handed her a flash drive. "This is the complete Common Grounds business plan we drafted. P&L, supply chain, financing, location scouting. It's all ready to go. My capital is secured. I've got enough cash to launch a full-scale specialty roaster tomorrow. But I need to know something, Steph." He looked her directly in the eye, dropping his guard completely. Arthur called it a secret relationship, a mistress. It wasn't. It was a secret alliance based on a shared dream. But that alliance is over. The fight for this shop is won, for a year at least. Now I have to ask you, do you want a professional partner in the Common Grounds, or was this just a necessary, temporary co-conspiracy? Because my future, my legacy, is in that flash drive, and it's completely dependent on you. She didn't answer immediately. She walked to the front of the shop and pulled a piping hot tray of cinnamon rolls out of the oven. The sweet, sharp aroma filled the air, a sensory symbol of the life she offered. She returned and placed a warm roll, glistening with icing, in his hand. "When you fixed that drain pipe, Ben, you didn't do it for the billable hours. You did it because you saw a physical problem and you knew how to solve it. When you sorted my taxes, you didn't do it for the trust. You did it to stabilize this shop." She looked down at the floor, then back up at him. "I fell for the man who loved the smell of my kitchen and got excited about roasting temperature curves. I didn't fall for the heir. The man who organized my chaos, who fought for my dream as if it were his own, that's the man I want standing next to me when we build the Common Grounds." She stepped closer, placing her hands firmly on his shoulders, mirroring the gesture he made before he fled from Sterling's camera flash. "Yes, Ben Blackwood, I need a partner, and I need a lover. I need you." He didn't hesitate this time. All the tension, the stress, and the fear of the last few months broke in that moment. He leaned in, finally bridging the gap that had been created by corporate rules and family expectation. Their kiss was messy and real, tasting of cinnamon, coffee, and the heady, terrifying flavor of absolute freedom. It wasn't the tentative, careful kiss of two people sneaking around. It was the committed kiss of two people who had just chosen a life together. "This is our legacy," Ben murmured, pulling back just enough to look at her, his voice thick with emotion. "It is," Stephanie confirmed, "but we have one immediate problem, partner. The arbitrator only protected this lease for a year. We need a new location, and we need to move fast. And we need to use this year to build a brand so strong, Arthur Blackwood can't squash it." Ben immediately shifted into full-time business mode, but with a palpable difference. His energy was now directed towards creation, not destruction. And Ben and Stephanie, no longer hiding, became a formidable team. Ben handled the real estate scouting and financing, Stephanie handled the brand identity, menu development, and crucially, the continued and successful operation of the daily grind. Their first challenge was finding a new location that offered the space and infrastructure needed for both a high-capacity bakery and a proper roastery. Ben discovered a derelict warehouse space in the revitalized South End, larger, rougher, but perfectly suited for their vision. It had high ceilings, industrial loading docks, and most importantly, space for their custom-built roaster. The cost was astronomical, but Ben's trust fund was liquid, and he was prepared to spend every cent. "It's beautiful, Steph," Ben said, showing her the renderings of the exposed brick and steel structure. "It's raw, it's ours, and it's 2 miles away from the Blackwood and Finch offices." Stephanie stood in the middle of the empty, dusty warehouse floor. "It feels like a future, Ben, not an inheritance. We take the Daily Grind's soul and we put it in this magnificent body." They decided on a new name, the Common Grounds Roasting Company, a name that evoked both community and the shared purpose that brought them together. But the final and most complicated challenge was Ben's relationship with his father. A week after the arbitration, Ben showed up at Arthur Blackwood's private home without an appointment. He wasn't there to apologize or beg. He was there to close the loop. Arthur met him in the study, his face colder and harder than Ben had ever seen it. "You have 5 minutes, Benjamin," Arthur said, not offering a seat. "You disgraced the name, threw away the partnership, and cost the trust a year of revenue on a prime asset. What could you possibly want?" "I want to tell you that I'm happy, Father. I've chosen my legacy. It will not be in liquidation. It will be in creation. And I'm going to use the capital you thought was earmarked for B&F to build the best coffee and bread experience in this city." Arthur laughed, a short, brittle sound devoid of humor. "You think baking bread is a legacy? You think a coffee shop is a proper use of the Blackwood name? You are a fool. You will fail, and you will come crawling back." Ben met his father's gaze, not with anger, but with finalization. "I won't, and my legacy will not be defined by a liquidation or a 9-figure acquisition. It will be defined by the quality of what I create, and I am damn good at it." He placed a single, small item on Arthur's massive mahogany desk, the worn copy of the World Atlas of Coffee that had been hidden in his bottom drawer for years. "I'm keeping the name, Father, but I'm changing the meaning of the legacy. This is my resignation from the Blackwood line of succession." He turned and walked out, leaving Arthur Blackwood alone in the silence of his gilded cage, staring at the small, defiant book. The price of freedom was high, but as Ben walked down the steps, breathing the crisp Boston air, he knew he had bought his entire life back. The only life left now was the one he and Stephanie were building, brick by dusty brick, in the South End.
The next 12 months were a whirlwind of construction, renovation, and sheer, joyful labor. The lease at the Daily Grind became a temporary headquarters, a sanctuary where Stephanie continued to bake while Ben oversaw the transformation of the vast South End warehouse. They were together, openly and constantly, their professional synergy now inextricably linked with their deepening romantic commitment. Ben had never worked harder in his life. He traded his tailored suits for heavy-duty work boots and dusty jeans. He was on site every day, not just overseeing the construction crews, but actively participating, learning the zoning codes for commercial roasters, wiring the 3-phase electrical system, and designing the workflow for maximum baking and roasting efficiency. His old legal training proved invaluable, allowing him to navigate permits and contracts with the ruthless precision Arthur Blackwood had taught him. The difference was, he was building something that smelled like home. Stephanie, meanwhile, maintained the Daily Grind's community presence, ensuring the arbitrator's decision was justified. She held more poetry nights, expanded her kids' baking classes, and used the shop as a tasting laboratory for their new proprietary blends. She tested out dozens of bean varietals Ben had sourced, refining the flavor profiles for their official launch menu.
The transformation culminated 6 weeks before the protected lease at 147 Beacon Street was due to expire. The Common Grounds Roasting Co. was ready. It was everything their vision promised. A massive, sun-drenched space with an open-concept kitchen and a prominent, gleaming roaster visible to all customers. The scent inside was phenomenal, a potent blend of fresh-baked bread, dark chocolate, and the complex, nutty aroma of green coffee undergoing the Maillard reaction. They hosted a soft opening for their closest community members. Maya from the art gallery, the elderly couple from the antique shop, the parents whose kids attended the baking classes, and the many regulars from the daily grind. It was a celebratory, emotional scene. Just as the line for the espresso machine snaked out the door, Ben found Stephanie leaning against the large silver roaster, the dragon from their old shop, which they had lovingly restored and moved. "We did it, partner," Ben said, pulling her close. He looked down at her, her face glowing with flower and pride. "It's a bigger legacy than I ever imagined." "It's only the beginning," Stephanie replied, her eyes shining. "We took the old, musty, neglected part of your family's asset, and we turned it into something beautiful and essential. We chose creation over liquidation, Ben." He kissed her, a brief, passionate affirmation of their shared journey. The grand opening was a resounding success, attracting not just the loyal Beacon Hill crowd, but also serious coffee aficionados and food critics from across the city. The Boston Herald gave them a glowing review, specifically praising Ben Blackwood's financial acuity applied to artisanal craft and Stephanie Moore's world-class sourdough that is worth the pilgrimage. 3 weeks later, Ben received an unexpected final piece of mail. It was a formal, engraved envelope from Arthur Blackwood. Inside was not a legal threat or a letter of reconciliation, but a small, stiff piece of paper, a check, drawn on the Blackwood family trust account. It was a substantial sum, exactly equivalent to the startup capital Ben had invested in the South End warehouse and equipment, covering the entirety of his private trust fund. Attached was a single, non-negotiable note, typed on Blackwood and Finch letterhead, signed with an initial AB. A loan repayment, no interest, no obligation. A proper Blackwood always ensures his assets are protected from undue personal risk. Now, run your business. And for God's sakes, stop using that cursed little French press. Your coffee is too good for it. A proper Blackwood always uses the best equipment. It was the closest Arthur Blackwood would ever come to an admission of respect. He couldn't acknowledge Ben's happiness or the choice he had made, but he could acknowledge the financial stability of the new venture. Ben laughed, a full, relieved, booming sound. His father was still trying to control the narrative, but in his own cold corporate way, he had ratified Ben's new life. He walked over to Stephanie, who was meticulously dialing in the new espresso grinder. He showed her the check. "My father just paid for our new roastery," he chuckled. "He tried to destroy our legacy, and instead he financed it." Stephanie read the note, then looked at the substantial figure on the check, her jaw dropping. "He called my French press cursed and essentially told you to scale up? Your father is a terrible, ruthless man, Ben Blackwood, but he is a glorious capitalist." "So what do we do with an unexpected gift?" Ben asked, wrapping his arms around her, inhaling the familiar, intoxicating scent of yeast and fresh grind. Stephanie smiled, a confident, entrepreneurial glint in her hazel eyes. "We buy a second industrial-sized roaster, partner. We double production, we go national, and we prove that our legacy, built on creation, honesty, and incredible coffee, is stronger and more enduring than any amount of paper or precedent." He kissed her again, this time a promise of the years of hard work, passion, and flavor that lay ahead. He had walked away from the gilded cage, not just with a woman he loved, but with a life he had built, a new legacy entirely his own, seasoned by the dust of an old shop and the courage to choose coffee over comfort.
It was a brilliant autumn afternoon, exactly 1 year and 3 months after Judge Vance's decisive ruling. The scent of cinnamon and dark roast hung thick and inviting in the air of the Common Grounds Roasting Co. The warehouse, once dusty and derelict, was now a bustling hub of commerce and community, filled with the loud, joyful clatter of a thriving business. Ben Blackwood, no longer in a corporate suit, but comfortably wearing a thick, charcoal gray apron, expertly maneuvered a pallet jack loaded with sacks of green coffee from Guatemala. His body was leaner, his hands rougher, and the lines of stress around his eyes had been replaced by the focused concentration of a man doing work he loved. He glanced over at the open kitchen, where Stephanie, coated in a fine dusting of flour, was directing a small team of bakers. They had scaled up, hired 7 full-time employees, and were now supplying artisanal bread to 4 top-tier Boston restaurants. The retail coffee line was quickly becoming a recognizable brand throughout New England. Their life was chaotic, demanding, and utterly fulfilling. They had moved into a loft apartment above the Roasting Co., eliminating the commute and blending their lives seamlessly together. Their late-night planning sessions over spreadsheets now ended with them falling asleep, side by side, smelling faintly of espresso and yeast. The biggest change, however, was in Ben's family. Ben still hadn't seen his father, Arthur Blackwood, but the occasional strange communication continued. 6 months ago, a massive, gleaming new espresso machine, the latest $20,000 model, had been delivered to the Roasting Co. with no sender address, only a note: "A proper Blackwood always invests in quality infrastructure." Ben had laughed, installed it, and sent a receipt for the installation costs to Blackwood and Finch, marked paid in full. The only member of his family who maintained contact was his mother. She had started visiting the Common Grounds, always discreetly, during the mid-morning lull. She came not to reconcile, but to witness. She never stayed long, ordering a simple filter coffee and a slice of Stephanie's famous apple cake, which she ate slowly, sitting at a small table by the window. On this particular afternoon, she approached Ben just as he finished bagging a fresh batch of Ethiopian yergachev. "Benjamin," she said, softly, touching his arm. "Hi, Mom," he replied, smiling genuinely. "The usual?" "Yes, thank you. The coffee is wonderful, darling. I read the Herald review again. It was glowing." She paused, then lowered her voice. "Your father is struggling to finalize the liquidation of the Beacon Hill property. It's been tied up in red tape because of Judge Vance's ruling. It's costing the trust a fortune in missed opportunity fees." He simply nodded, nonplussed. The legal world that wants to find him now felt utterly distant. "That's unfortunate for the trust." "He is proud, Ben, more than anything. But he knows you won. He never would have financed that new equipment otherwise." She took a deep breath, and her eyes welled up slightly. "I worry about him being so alone." "He has his legacy, Mom," he said gently. "He chose it. I chose mine." He kissed her cheek. "Enjoy your cake." As she walked away, Stephanie approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "What was the news from the enemy camp?" "The enemy camp is still losing money on the Beacon Hill lease," Ben chuckled, pulling her close. "And my mother thinks my father is losing his mind trying to reconcile his pride with our success." He looked out across the bustling floor, past the long communal table where customers were working and chatting, toward the industrial door where the delivery trucks pulled up. He saw the future spread out before them, smelling of potential and freshly roasted beans. "We have a year left on the protected lease," Ben stated, a familiar, excited glint in his eye. "What do we do with 147 Beacon Street when the lease expires?" Stephanie didn't even have to think about it. "We don't renew it. We call up Arthur Blackwood's lawyer, politely decline, and let him have his empty building back. We don't need the fight anymore.
we have the Common Grounds Roasting Co. She tilted her head, giving him a look that was part baker, part shrewd business partner, and entirely the woman she loved. And we get to focus on what matters. We just secured a contract with a distributor in New York City. We need to hire 2 more roasters. And I think it's time to start thinking about a name for the sourdough starter that funded all this. Ben laughed, a rich, full sound that resonated with true happiness. Perfect. Let's name the starter, finalize the New York contract, and then let's go home. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and together they turned to face the organized chaos of their shared, hard-won future.
Ben and Stephanie proved that a true legacy isn't inherited. It's baked from scratch. They walked away from the gilded cage and into a life filled with purpose, community, and the intoxicating smell of their own success. Their story is a powerful reminder that the biggest risks often come with the sweetest rewards. The question isn't whether they survived the corporate fallout. It's whether you're ready to start building your own common grounds. If you were rooting for Ben and Stephanie to choose love over law, hit that subscribe button. I share inspiring stories of massive career pivots and defiant romance every single day. Want to dive deeper into the world of entrepreneurial love stories? Click the playlist on your screen now to see more tales of people who quit their day jobs to chase their dreams. And tell me in the comments, if you could quit your job tomorrow and start any business, what would it be? We'll be down in the comments, brewing up some inspiration. Thanks for watching.